high in the rugged mountains of Armenia, and in a cave known as the Qumran Caves, and a Bedouin shepherd in 1946 made a discovery that would reshape humanity's understanding of its own ancient past. Among the brittle and decaying scrolls lay a text so controversial it was excluded from the biblical canon, the Book of Enoch. In its pages, and a chilling account describes not angels, but watchers, divine beings who swore a sacred oath on Mount Hermon and descended to earth, and fathered a race of giants known as the Nephilim. This narrative, and preserved in fragments of Aramaic and Ge'ez, and has haunted theologians and archaeologists for centuries. But who were these watchers? And what did their descent truly unleash upon humanity? The answers lie buried within ancient scrolls and celestial alignments, and the echoes of a pact made under a star-filled sky. This investigation examines the original source text to uncover the truth behind the fallen angels who changed humanity forever. The Book of Enoch, and specifically the section known as the Book of the Watchers, 1st Enoch, chapters 1 through 36, presents the most detailed ancient account of these celestial beings. In the Hebrew Bible, and a single reference in the book of Daniel chapter 4 verse 13 and 17, calls them holy watchers, divine messengers tasked with observing humanity. Yet the Enochic tradition expands this role dramatically. The narrative begins in the antediluvian age, and a time when humanity had multiplied across the earth. The watchers, and led by a chief named Shemihazah, and looked upon the daughters of men, and found them beautiful. The text, and in 1st Enoch chapter 6 verse 1 through 2, and states, "And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters." This was not a passive observation. It was a transgression of divine order. The watchers then made a critical decision. They descended upon Mount Hermon, a real geographical location in the southern anti-Lebanon mountain range, and sacred in Canaanite and later Israelite tradition. The name Hermon itself may derive from the Hebrew cherem and meaning devoted to destruction, or under a ban, a linguistic clue to the gravity of their pact. Archaeological evidence from the site of Mount Hermon reveals ancient cultic activity, and including stone altars and inscriptions dedicated to the god Baal. Cross-referencing this with Sumerian and Akkadian texts, and such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we find parallel accounts of divine beings, the Anunnaki, descending to earth and interacting with humans. In the Sumerian king list, and these beings are described as kings who descended from heaven, ruling for fantastical spans of time. While direct parallels are debated, and the shared motif of celestial beings mating with mortals suggests a common ancient Near Eastern tradition, the consequences of the Watcher's oath were immediate and catastrophic. The union of Watchers and human women produced the Nephilim, giants of immense size and insatiable appetite. The Nephilim were not merely large. They were a corrupting force, and turning the earth into a state of chaos and violence. The text emphasizes that their hunger consumed all resources, and leading to widespread suffering. Yet the Watchers also transgressed in another way. They taught forbidden knowledge. According to 1st Enoch chapter 8 verse 1 through 4, and Azazel, a prominent watcher, and taught humans the art of metalworking, and enabling the creation of weapons and jewelry and cosmetics. Other watchers imparted astrology and sorcery, and the cutting of roots for medicinal purposes. This knowledge, and while seemingly beneficial, and was framed as corrupting and blurring the line between divine order and human autonomy. The text condemns these teachings as the secrets of heaven that should have remained hidden. The narrative culminates in a divine response. The archangels Michael and Gabriel, Raphael and Phanuel bring the cries of humanity before God. In 1st Enoch chapter 9 verse 1 through 10, and they plead, "The whole earth has been filled with blood and unrighteousness." God then decrees judgment. The watchers are to be bound in the valleys of the earth until the final judgment, and while the Nephilim are to be destroyed by war and pestilence. This judgment is not merely punitive, It serves to restore cosmic order. The Book of Enoch thus presents the Watchers as a bridge between the divine and human realms, and whose descent shattered the boundaries of creation. Their oath on Mount Hermon and the birth of the Nephilim, and the teaching of forbidden knowledge form the core of a narrative that has echoed through millennia. This ancient text, and preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon and fragments from Qumran, and offers a window into how early Jewish communities understood the origins of evil and the nature of divine justice, and the fragility of human existence. The Watchers are not simply fallen angels. They are a warning of what happens when the Watchers become the watched. This etymology reflects their primary function. They were celestial guardians and set apart to observe humanity and the created order. Unlike the Western Christian emphasis on fallen angels as mere rebels, and Orthodox theology preserves a more nuanced understanding of the Gregories' original purpose and their subsequent transgression. The earliest Orthodox sources, and including the Book of the Watchers within the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, and describe the Grigori as a distinct order of angels. They were not among the highest choirs, and such as the seraphim or cherubim, but were stationed as sentinels between heaven and earth. Their duty was to maintain the boundary between the divine and human realms, and a responsibility that placed them in direct proximity to humanity's growing corruption before the flood. Orthodox tradition, and particularly as preserved in the writings of Saint John of Damascus and later Byzantine theologians, and classifies the Grigori among the second rank of angels. Their fall is not portrayed as a rebellion against God's authority, but as a descent into forbidden intimacy with the material world. The sin of the Grigori was one of misplaced guardianship. They abandoned their celestial posts to pursue human women, and thereby violating the cosmic hierarchy. The Slavonic Book of Enoch, and a text preserved in the Eastern Orthodox Slavic tradition, and provides additional detail. It names 20 leaders of the Grigori, and each commanding a group of 10 angels. These leaders, and including Shemihazah and Azazel and Barakal, and are depicted not as demons in the modern sense, but as beings who became corrupted through their own actions. Eastern Orthodox demonology integrates the Grigori into a broader understanding of spiritual warfare. Unlike the Western concept of demons as purely malevolent entities, and Orthodox tradition views the fallen Watchers as beings who have distorted their original nature. They retain their knowledge and power, but now use it to deceive and enslave humanity. This is evident in the Orthodox iconographic tradition, and where the Grigori are often depicted with darkened faces and bound chains, and symbolizing their imprisonment in Tartarus, a concept derived from 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4 and Jude chapter 1 verse 6. The Orthodox Church Fathers, and particularly Saint Ephrem the Syrian and Saint Athanasius of Alexandria, and interpreted the Grigori's fall as a warning against spiritual pride. Ephrem's commentary on Genesis argues that the Watchers' sin was not merely carnal but intellectual. They sought to elevate themselves above their appointed station by teaching forbidden knowledge. This teaching included astrology and herbalism, and metallurgy, arts that, and while neutral in themselves, and were corrupted by the Watchers' rebellious intent. Archaeological evidence from the Byzantine period supports the Orthodox emphasis on the Grigori's role as guardians. In the monastery of St. Catherine at Mount Sinai, and a 6th century icon depicts the Watchers as winged figures with their eyes fixed downward and their hands raised in a gesture of prayer. This iconography reflects the Orthodox belief that the Watchers, and even in their fallen state, and remain bound to their original purpose of observation, now turn toward humanity's sin rather than its protection. The Orthodox liturgical tradition also preserves echoes of the Grigori narrative. In the great canon of St. Andrew of Crete, and chanted during Lent, and the faithful are warned against the sleep of the Watchers, a spiritual lethargy that leads to transgression. This metaphor connects the Grigori's failure to maintain vigilance with the believer's own struggle against temptation. Modern Orthodox theologians, and such as metropolitan hierotheos Vlachos, and have revisited the Grigori tradition to address contemporary questions about the nature of evil. Vlachos argues that the Watcher's fall demonstrates the danger of spiritual beings becoming obsessed with the material world. Their story serves as a cautionary tale for humanity, and which must guard against the same temptation to prioritize earthly knowledge over divine obedience. In the Eastern Orthodox worldview and the Grigori are not merely ancient figures of myth, but ongoing realities within the spiritual landscape. This living tradition ensures that the story of the fallen angels remains not a distant legend, but a present warning, a reminder that even the most exalted beings can fall when they abandon their appointed place. Within the sprawling corpus of Nag Hammadi, and discovered in Upper Egypt in 1945, and the Watchers undergo a radical theological transformation. Gnostic texts do not simply recount their fall. They recategorize these beings as archons, cosmic administrators of a flawed material reality, unlike the Orthodox tradition, and which locates the Watchers within a celestial hierarchy that fell through pride, and Gnostic cosmology positions them as essential and albeit malevolent and components of the creation itself. The Apocrypha of John and a foundational Sethian Gnostic text and describes a divine chain of emanations from the unknowable and true God, the monad. At the lowest level of this spiritual descent, and the chief archon and Yaldabaoth is born from the error of Sophia and divine wisdom. Yaldabaoth and a lion-faced serpent, and creates a material cosmos in arrogant imitation of the higher and spiritual realms. He then fashions a counterfeit humanity, and trapping divine sparks within physical bodies. It is here that the Watchers find their new identity. They are not angels who fell. They are the archons themselves, and the ruling powers of the 7 planetary spheres, and created by Yaldabaoth to govern the material prison, and to ensure that the human soul remains ignorant of its divine origin. The Gnostic reinterpretation of Genesis 6 is therefore a cosmic drama of entrapment and not seduction. The sons of God are not heavenly beings who descended out of lust, but archontic forces who descended to further enslave humanity. The hypostasis of the archons details how the archons, and seeing the beauty of the spiritual light within the first human, and attempted to rape Eve. This act is not a fall from grace, but a deliberate strategy to pollute the human lineage with their own material and psychic substance, and thereby binding the divine spark more tightly to the physical world. The Nephilim, and in this context, and are not heroic giants, but the hybrid offspring of this violent cosmic violation, beings who embody the corruption of the material realm. The role of Enoch is also profoundly redefined. In Gnostic texts, and Enoch is not the righteous scribe who ascends to intercede. He is the enlightened one, and the Gnostic who has seen through the archon's deception. The Apocalypse of Adam presents Enoch as a revealer of secret knowledge, and who passes on the true history of creation, a history that the archons have attempted to suppress. His writings become a coded manual for the soul's ascent, and teaching how to navigate the 7 planetary spheres, and deceive their archontic guardians by uttering the correct passwords and performing the proper rituals. The Watchers are no longer beings to be feared or venerated. They are obstacles to be overcome. This cosmological shift carries profound implications. The sin of the Watchers is not a moral failing of pride or lust, but an ontological flaw inherent in the material universe itself. They are not fallen angels who might repent. They are the jailers of the divine spark, and their nature is fundamentally opposed to spiritual liberation. The forbidden knowledge they teach, metallurgy and cosmetics, astrology, is not a corrupting influence in the orthodox sense. Rather, and it is a further layer of material entanglement, and designed to keep humanity focused on the physical world and blind to the spiritual reality beyond it. Cross-referencing this with earlier Mesopotamian sources reveals a fascinating parallel. The Sumerian descent of Inanna describes the goddess's passage through 7 gates, and where she is stripped of her divine garments and powers by gatekeepers. In Gnostic cosmology, and these gatekeepers become the archons and the watchers, and who demand the soul surrender its spiritual attributes. The Pistis Sophia details the soul's journey through these same spheres, and where it must confront the emanations of the self-willed, the archontic beings who rule each realm. Archaeologically, and the Nag Hammadi codices offer no new images of the Watchers as giants or guardians. Instead, and they present diagrams of the pleroma and the spiritual fullness and the material cosmos. One codex contains a crude drawing of the 7 planetary spheres, and each ruled by an archon with an animal head, a visual representation of the Watchers as cosmic wardens. These are not beings of the desert or mountain. They are beings of the sky and the celestial spheres that separate the human soul from the true God. In Gnostic thought, and the Watchers are thus the final and tragic intermediaries. They stand between humanity and the monad, and not as guides, but as the last and most terrible obstacle. Their story is not one of a fall, but of an eternal and hostile vigilance, and the only hope for humanity lies not in intercession, but in escape through hidden knowledge. The Book of Genesis presents the flood as a response to a world consumed by violence. The Hebrew word used is Hamas, a term denoting not merely physical brutality, but systemic corruption and lawlessness, and the breakdown of cosmic order. Yet Genesis offers no explicit origin for this condition. It is in the Book of Enoch that the missing cause is supplied. The Watchers, and by teaching forbidden arts and interbreeding with human women, and did not simply introduce sin. They fundamentally altered the biological and spiritual constitution of humanity, the offspring of these unions and the Nephilim, and are described in the Book of Enoch as giants who consumed the labor of all men. When human food supplies proved insufficient, and they turned to cannibalism and devouring birds and fish, and finally, and human flesh and blood. This is the violence that filled the earth, a direct consequence of angelic transgression. The Dead Sea Scrolls, and particularly the Genesis Apocryphon, and expand this narrative. This Aramaic text, and discovered at Qumran, and retells the flood story with explicit reference to the Watchers. It describes Noah's birth as an event of cosmic significance. His appearance so radiant that his father Lamech suspects angelic paternity. The scroll depicts Noah as a being of pure lineage and untainted by the corruption spreading across the earth. This detail is crucial. The flood becomes not a random act of divine anger, but a surgical intervention to preserve an uncorrupted bloodline. The Watcher's judgment is pronounced in the Book of Enoch with chilling specificity. God commands the archangels to bind Azazel hand and foot, and casting him into darkness in the desert of Judil. He is to remain there until the day of judgment, and when he will be cast into the fire. For the other Watchers and their punishment is to witness the destruction of their own children. They are bound beneath the hills of the earth for 70 generations, and their spirits imprisoned until the final judgment. This is not a fall from heaven into earth. It is a fall from grace into geological confinement. The flood narrative in Mesopotamian sources provides a parallel but distinct framework. The Atrahasis epic describes a world overpopulated by humans whose noise disturbs the god Enlil. The solution is a flood, but the Sumerian king list presents a more telling detail. Before the flood, and kings reigned for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, and lifespans contract dramatically. This mirrors the biblical chronology, and where antediluvian patriarchs live nearly a millennium, and while post-flood figures like Abraham live only 175 years. The Watcher's intervention may have altered not just human morality, but human biology itself. The Book of Jubilees and another Second Temple text, and reframes the flood as a direct response to the Watcher's corruption. It states that the angels were sent to earth to instruct humanity in justice, but instead defiled themselves. Their judgment is therefore a breach of divine trust. Jubilees aligns the flood with the Watcher's imprisonment, and suggesting both events are simultaneous acts of cosmic cleansing. Archaeological evidence from the ancient Near East offers a sobering context. Excavations at sites like and Shurapak reveal layers of flood deposits dating to approximately 2900 BCE. These are localized events and not global cataclysms, but they shaped the collective memory of Mesopotamian civilizations. The biblical authors and writing centuries later, and may have synthesized these flood traditions with the Watcher mythology to produce a unified theological explanation. The flood was not a natural disaster, but a necessary reset of a creation corrupted by angelic rebellion. The Watchers and then are not merely fallen angels. They are the proximate cause of the flood, the catalyst that forced divine intervention. Their actions created a world so irredeemably polluted that only total destruction could restore order. The flood narrative, and when read through the lens of the Watcher tradition, and becomes a story of containment. The corruption of the flesh is drowned, and the giants are exterminated, and the Watchers themselves are imprisoned beneath the earth. Only Noah and his family, and preserved through the ark, and carry forward a humanity now purified of angelic taint. Yet the Watcher's legacy does not end with the flood. The Book of Enoch warns that the spirits of the Nephilim, and upon their physical death, and became demons roaming the earth. The flood destroyed their bodies, but released their souls. These spirits, and the text claims, and continue to corrupt humanity, and leading to idolatry and violence, and the worship of false gods. The flood cleansed the earth of giant flesh, but the spiritual contamination of the Watchers persists, an invisible inheritance that the authors of Enoch believed still plagued their own world. The narrative of the Watchers, and while most fully preserved in 1 Enoch, and was not an isolated tradition. It permeated the theological consciousness of Second Temple Judaism, and appearing in a constellation of apocryphal and pseudepigraphal works that expanded and clarified, and sometimes contested the story of the fallen angels. The Book of Jubilees, and composed in the 2nd century BCE, and offers a chronologically structured retelling of Genesis and Exodus. Within its framework, and the Watchers are not merely a prelude to the flood. They are a fundamental corruption of the created order. Jubilees chapter 4 verse 15 identifies the Watchers as angels sent to earth to teach humanity justice and uprightness. This mission is critical. Their fall was not a spontaneous rebellion, but a dereliction of duty. They were to instruct, and yet they descended into transgression. Jubilees chapter 5 verse 1 through 2 provides a stark and legalistic account. This language of ordinance-breaking frames the sin as a violation of divine law and a breach of cosmic boundaries. The punishment is swift and absolute. God binds them in the depths of the earth until the final judgment. However, in Jubilees adds a chilling detail concerning their offspring. The giants and the Nephilim and began to slay each other and devour humanity. But before their destruction, and the text notes that the giants' spirits, the demons, were allowed to remain on earth to lead humanity astray. This transforms the Watcher's legacy from a single historical event into an ongoing and spiritual conflict. The corruption is not confined to the past. It is an active and malevolent presence. The testament of the 12 patriarchs, and a collection of ethical teachings attributed to Jacob's sons, and integrates the Watchers into its moral framework. In the Testament of Reuben, chapter 5, verse 6 through 7, and the patriarch warns against lust, and citing the Watchers as the ultimate cautionary tale. The Watchers are not just fallen angels. They are a moral archetype and a warning against the dangers of unchecked desire and the violation of natural order. The text emphasizes that the Watchers were transformed into the shape of men to accomplish their seduction and blurring the line between the divine and the human. The second book of Baruch, or the Syriac Apocalypse of Baruch, composed after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, and offers a more philosophical reflection. In 2 Baruch chapter 56, verse 10 through 16, and the Watchers are cited as the origin of the beginning of evils on earth. However, and Baruch's perspective is eschatological. The Watchers are not merely historical figures, they are a sign of the coming judgment. Their binding and imprisonment prefigure the final punishment of all who rebel against God. The text repeatedly connects the Watchers' fall with the broader cosmic rebellion, and linking them to the serpent in Eden and the eventual defeat of Satan. Cross-referencing these texts reveals a consistent theological development. The Watchers are not simply angels who sinned. They are the embodiment of a cosmic principle of transgression. Their story is used to explain the origin of evil and the persistence of demonic influence and the necessity of divine judgment. The Book of Jubilees provides the legal framework for their punishment. The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs offers a moral application. The second book of Baruch connects their fall to the ultimate eschatological resolution. Together, and these works demonstrate that the Watchers' tradition was a living and evolving theology. It was not a single and fixed story, but a flexible narrative used to address fundamental questions of good and evil and the nature of the divine. The Watchers, and in these texts, and serve as a bridge between the primordial past and the present struggle for righteousness, and a constant reminder of the consequences of crossing the boundary between the heavenly and the earthly. Their legacy, and as preserved in Jewish Apocrypha, and is not just a story of a fall, but a map of the moral and spiritual dangers that continue to haunt humanity. The Quran does not name the Watchers, yet it preserves a parallel tradition of angels who fell not through lust, but through a test of moral knowledge. In Surah Al-Baqarah and verse 102, and the text speaks of two angels in Babylon, Harut and Marut, who taught mankind sorcery. The passage is brief, but its implications are profound. Unlike the Watchers of 1 Enoch, and who descended to teach, and then transgressed through forbidden union, and Harut and Marut were sent deliberately. They came not as rebels, but as agents of divine trial. Their purpose was to reveal forbidden knowledge, specifically, and the mechanisms of magic, so that humanity might be tested. This framing shifts the narrative. The Watchers in Jewish tradition acted autonomously and driven by desire. Harut and Marut acted under command, and their transgression occurring after their mission. Islamic exegesis, and particularly in the works of Al-Tabari and Al-Qurtubi, and expands this distinction. According to these scholars, and the angels were not corrupted by human women, but by their own pride. They judged humanity harshly from heaven, and God sent them to earth to experience human temptation firsthand. Once incarnated, and they succumbed to sin, drunkenness and idolatry, and murder. The parallels to the Watchers are structural and not identical. Both traditions involve angels who descend and impart forbidden knowledge, and are punished, but the nature of that knowledge differs. In 1 Enoch, and the Watchers taught metallurgy and cosmetics, and astrology, arts that enabled human corruption. In Islam, and Harut and Marut taught sorcery, specifically, and the means to separate a husband from his wife. The Quran emphasizes this was a test, and not a gift. It states that the knowledge could only harm those who used it, and that the angels themselves warned against misuse. Archaeologically, and the city of Babylon looms large in this tradition. This geographic anchor is significant. Babylon, and in Mesopotamian history, and was a center of astral religion and magical practice. Cuneiform tablets from the Neo-Babylonian period, such as the Sherpu and Maklu incantation series, document elaborate rituals for countering witchcraft. The Quranic narrative may preserve an ancient memory of these practices, and reinterpreted through a monotheistic lens. The fate of Harut and Marut also diverges from the Watchers. In 1, Enoch and the fallen angels are bound in the valleys of the earth until judgment. Harut and Marut, and according to Islamic tradition, and remain suspended in a pit near Babylon and chained upside down between heaven and earth. This image, angels neither fully punished nor redeemed, creates a liminal state. They are not demons, but they are no longer of heaven. Theological resonance emerges in the figure of Iblis. In Islam, Iblis is a jinn and not a fallen angel. He refused to bow to Adam and was cast out. This distinction is crucial. Angels in Islam are incapable of rebellion by nature. Harut and Marut and therefore represent an exception, a deliberate anomaly within an otherwise obedient celestial order. Some scholars, and like Ibn Kathir, argued they were not true angels, but a different class of being and sent as a test. Others maintained their angelic origin, and noting that God's command could override their innate obedience. The Enochic tradition, and by contrast, presents the Watchers as the origin of evil. Their fall introduces demonic spirits into the world. In Islam, evil originates with Iblis and the jinn, and not with angels. Harut and Marut are a localized test, and not a cosmic rebellion. The difference is fundamental. The Watchers changed humanity forever. Harut and Marut tested humanity within a fixed moral order. Yet the parallels persist. Both narratives involve angels who descend and teach forbidden arts, and are punished. Both locate the event in the ancient Near East. Both raise questions about divine justice and human free will. The Quran does not cite one Enoch, but the structural similarities suggest a shared wellspring, a common memory of celestial beings who crossed a boundary and whose knowledge became a burden. In the end, Harut and Marut remain suspended. They are not the architects of a fallen world, but a reminder that even the heavens can be tested. The Watchers fell through desire. Harut and Marut fell through judgment. The difference is subtle, but it reshapes the entire theology of angelic transgression. The Watchers themselves were not demons. They were angels, holy beings who made an unholy choice. Yet by the close of the Second Temple period, a profound theological shift was underway. The offspring of the Watchers and the Nephilim, were being systematically redefined, and not merely as giants of flesh and blood, but as the spiritual ancestors of demonic entities. The key text in this transformation is the Book of the Watchers, preserved within one Enoch. In its earliest layers, the narrative is stark. The Watchers descend and take human wives and teach forbidden knowledge. Their children are giants who devour human provision and then turn to cannibalism. But the text does not stop with their physical destruction. In 1 Enoch chapter 15 verse 8 through 12, a crucial passage emerges. God speaks directly to the imprisoned Watchers and declaring, "But now the giants, who are born from the spirits of flesh, shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and their dwelling shall be upon the earth." Here is the doctrinal pivot. The flesh of the Nephilim perishes in the great flood, but their spirits, released from their monstrous bodies, survive. These disembodied spirits are not angels. They are not human souls. They are a third category, the offspring of a forbidden union, and now condemned to roam the earth as corrupting forces. The text explicitly states these spirits will cause destruction and lead astray humanity until the final judgment. Early Christian writers seized upon this framework. The 2nd century apologist Justin Martyr, in his second apology, argued that the demons of pagan mythology were precisely these fallen Watchers and their Nephilim offspring. This was not a metaphor. It was an etiology, a direct explanation for the origin of every malevolent spirit that ancient peoples encountered. Athenagoras of Athens, writing around 177 CE, expanded the argument. In his plea for the Christians, he distinguished between the Watchers, now imprisoned, and the demons who roam free, their offspring and the giants, were those souls which the giants gave up, and these became the wandering demons that plague humanity. For Athenagoras, these demons were not abstract forces. They were the entities behind idolatry and disease and the deceptive oracles of pagan temples. The Jewish tradition, while more cautious, developed a parallel trajectory. The Book of Jubilees, a 2nd century BCE text, rewrites the Genesis narrative to emphasize that evil spirits were a direct consequence of the Watchers' transgression. In Jubilees 10 and Noah prays to God to imprison all the spirits of the Nephilim, but God allows 1/10 to remain under the authority of Mastema, a satanic figure, to test humanity. This concept of a permitted remnant of evil spirits and controlled, but not eliminated, and became foundational for later demonology. By the time of the New Testament, and this framework was assumed. The author of 2 Peter similarly describes the fallen angels cast into Tartarus, and a Greek term for the abyss and awaiting judgment. The archaeological record supports this theological evolution. The Dead Sea Scrolls, and particularly the Book of Giants, found at Qumran, and depict the Nephilim not merely as giants, but as beings with dream visions and spiritual power. One fragment describes a giant named Hahir seeing a tablet being immersed in water, and a symbol of their impending destruction. Another fragment records the giants pleading with Enoch to intercede for them, but their petition is denied. Their fate is sealed. Physical death, but spiritual continuation as corrupting forces. This demonology was not born in a vacuum. It drew upon ancient Mesopotamian concepts of Edemu, the vengeful spirits of the unburied dead, and Persian dualism, and which posited a cosmic struggle between good and evil. But the Watchers tradition provided a uniquely Jewish and Christian answer to a universal question. Where do demons come from? The answer was not a primordial rebellion of a single satanic figure, but a specific and historical act of angelic transgression. The Watchers, and therefore, are not merely the origin of giants. They are the theological root of demonology itself, their offspring and the Nephilim, and became the template for every evil spirit that would haunt the human imagination for millennia, not as fallen angels, but as something far more disturbing, the hybrid spirits of a forbidden age, and condemned to wander until the final fire. The Watchers of the Book of Enoch did not emerge from a vacuum. Their narrative is deeply embedded in the mythic soil of the ancient Near East. The written record of the 3rd millennium BCE reveals a class of beings that predates the Hebrew scribes, the Apkallu of Mesopotamia, 7 primordial sages and partfish, partman, and who emerged from the sweet waters of the Abzu. Cuneiform tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal describe the Apkallu as servants of the god Enki. They were dispatched to humanity before the Great Flood and tasked with bringing the foundational elements of civilization, law and medicine, agriculture, and the sacred arts. The most famous of these and owns was described by the Babylonian priest Berossus in the 3rd century BCE as a being with the body of a fish and the head of a man beneath a fish head. He taught writing and geometry and the construction of cities. The parallels to the Watchers are structural and not coincidental. In the Sumerian king list, and these antediluvian sages reigned for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years, before the flood washed away their age. The Enochian tradition mirrors this precisely. The Watchers descended on Mount Hermon and taught forbidden knowledge, and their corruption led directly to the deluge. The theological difference is one of judgment. In Mesopotamia, and the Apkallu were agents of divine order. In the Hebrew redaction, and the Watchers were agents of transgression. The visual evidence is carved into stone. The Assyrian reliefs from the palace of Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud depict winged and eagle-headed figures, Apkallu guardians, standing at doorways and holding a bucket and a cone for purification. These are not fallen beings. They are protective spirits and intermediaries between the divine and human realms. Yet their iconography, hybrid form and wings, proximity to the throne of God, is the same symbolic language later applied to the Watchers. The difference is not in form but in function. Textual cross-references deepen the connection. The Atrahasis epic circa 18th century BCE describes the god Enlil sending a flood to reduce human overpopulation, but the god Enki saves the sage Atrahasis by instructing him to build an ark. The knowledge that saves humanity comes from a divine being who defies the other gods. This is the same narrative skeleton as the Watchers. A divine being shares forbidden wisdom, and humanity is both elevated and condemned by it. The Apkallu were also said to return in the post-Diluvian age, but in diminished form. The Uruk list of kings and sages notes that after the flood and the sages were no longer fully divine. They were human scholars who transmitted the antediluvian knowledge. This echoes the Enochian claim that the Watchers were bound, but their teachings persisted. Astrology and metallurgy, cosmetics, corrupting humanity long after the giants were dead. The Akkadian term Apkallu itself carries the weight of this transition. In the era, Epic and the Apkallu are described as having been sent into the Apsu, the subterranean water, by the god E, a confinement that mirrors the binding of the Watchers in the valleys of the earth. Both traditions agree. These beings were removed from the human stage, but their legacy remained. The Ugaritic texts from Ras Shamra introduce another parallel, the Rephaim and ancestral spirits who were once kings and heroes. The Hebrew Bible uses the same term, Rephaim, to describe the giants of Canaan and often conflated with the Nephilim. In the Ugaritic Epic of Gilgamesh and the Rephaim are divine beings who attend the king's feast. In the Hebrew tradition, and they are the cursed offspring of the Watchers. The same root word and the same mythological stratum, but inverted in moral value. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that the Qumran community saw these connections. In the Genesis, Apocrypha and Noah recounts his birth with language borrowed from Mesopotamian birth omens, a direct literary dependence. The scribes of Qumran did not invent the Watchers. They inherited a tradition that had been circulating for over 1,000 years, and from Sumer to Ugarit to Canaan. The evidence compels a conclusion. The Watchers are the Hebrew theological reinterpretation of a pan-Mesopotamian myth. The Apkallu taught civilization, the Watchers taught corruption. The Rephaim were honored ancestors. The Nephilim were abominations. The flood was a divine reset in both traditions, but in the Enochian version, and the cause was not overpopulation, but cosmic rebellion. The Watchers, and then, are not a unique invention. They are a specific theological refraction of a much older pattern, the story of beings who stood at the boundary between gods and men, and who, and depending on the telling, were either saviors or sinners. The Book of Enoch does not merely accuse the Watchers of rebellion. It provides a precise catalogue of their crimes. The text enumerates specific arts and sciences, and technologies that the 200 angels transmitted to humanity, knowledge deemed so dangerous that it fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization. The primary source for this indictment is the 7th chapter of the Ethiopic Book of Enoch. This transmission was not accidental. Each of the principal angels specialized in a distinct discipline, Shemihazah and the leader, and taught enchantments and root cuttings. Azazel instructed humanity in the making of knives and swords, shields and breastplates, the arts of metallurgy and warfare. Other named angels taught astrology and the observation of celestial signs, and the knowledge of clouds and the sun, and the use of precious stones and cosmetics. The text is remarkably specific. The angel Amaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakiel taught astrology. The angel Kokebel instructed in the constellations. The angel Penemu taught writing, and specifically the use of ink and paper, and with it, and the wisdom of the scribes. The angel Kashdegen taught the science of spirits and demons, and the binding and loosing of spiritual powers. The condemnation is not merely that the Watchers taught, but that they taught prematurely. Humanity, and according to this worldview, was not ready for such knowledge. The text implies that certain mysteries of the cosmos, the movements of the stars, and the manipulation of metals, and the formulas of sorcery, were reserved for the divine realm. By revealing these secrets, and the Watchers violated a cosmic boundary. The theological argument hinges on the nature of this knowledge. The Watchers did not teach agriculture and animal husbandry or basic survival skills, the arts necessary for human flourishing. Instead, they taught specialized and powerful and potentially corrupting disciplines. Mythology enabled weaponry and warfare. Cosmetics and precious stones led to vanity and idolatry. Sorcery and incantations granted access to spiritual powers meant to remain inaccessible. Astrology, and in the Enochic context, and was not astronomy, the neutral observation of stars, but the divinatory interpretation of celestial bodies and a practice that sought to predict and manipulate divine will. The Book of Jubilees, and a 2nd century BCE text, and reinforces this condemnation. Jubilees explicitly links these teachings to the corruption that led to the flood. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide further evidence of how this tradition was received. The Genesis Apocryphon, and found at Qumran, and retells the story of Noah and mentions the Watcher's teachings. The scrolls also contain fragments of the Book of Giants, and which elaborates on the violence and corruption that resulted from the Watcher's knowledge. The Qumran community saw themselves as living in a time of similar corruption, and they interpreted the Watcher's fall as a warning about the dangers of forbidden knowledge. The archaeological record offers no direct evidence of angelic instruction. However, and it does confirm the sudden appearance of complex technologies in the ancient Near East, the rise of metallurgy in the Chalcolithic period, and the development of writing in Sumer, and the sophisticated astronomical observations of the Babylonians all appear in the archaeological record as rapid advancements. The Enochic tradition provides a theological explanation for these historical phenomena, that such knowledge did not emerge through gradual human discovery, but through supernatural transmission. The Watchers, and then, are not merely fallen angels. They are the original transmitters of dangerous knowledge. Their teachings, and according to the Enochic texts, and corrupted humanity by granting access to powers that humans were not prepared to wield. The forbidden arts, metallurgy and sorcery, astrology and cosmetics, and writing became the instruments of humanity's moral decline. The Watchers' crime was not rebellion alone. It was the unauthorized education of a species that could not handle the truth. The first centuries of the Common Era presented a theological crisis. The nascent Christian Church, and consolidating its canon and doctrine, and inherited the Enochic tradition, but faced a difficult question. What status should the Watchers hold in Orthodox belief? Justin Martyr, and writing in the mid-2nd century, and provided one of the earliest patristic engagements with the fallen angels. In his second apology, and Justin directly referenced the Watchers as the source of pagan mythology. He argued that the demons, the offspring of these angels and human women, were the entities behind the false gods of Greece and Rome. For Justin and the Watchers were not merely ancient transgressors, they were the active and malevolent origin of all idolatry. The visual evidence, and he claimed and lay in the statues and temples of the empire, each one a monument to the corrupted knowledge transmitted by the fallen. Irenaeus of Lyons, and writing circa 180 CE, and deepened this framework in his work against heresies. Irenaeus, and a bishop, and was primarily concerned with Gnostic sects that claimed secret knowledge from angelic intermediaries. He turned the Watcher tradition against them. Irenaeus asserted that the true apostolic tradition, and not hidden angelic revelation, and was the sole source of divine truth. He explicitly linked the Watchers to the flood narrative, and describing their offspring, the Nephilim, as beings of immense physical and spiritual corruption. In Irenaeus's view, and the Watchers had attempted to breach a divine boundary, and their punishment was both just and absolute. The archaeological record of the ancient Near East, and with its depictions of hybrid beings and giant figures, and served as a visual testament to this corrupted lineage. Tertullian, and writing in Carthage around 200 CE, and provided the most extensive patristic analysis. In his treatise on the apparel of women, and Tertullian directly cited the Book of Enoch as scripture. He argued that the Watchers were the inventors of cosmetics and jewelry and luxurious adornments, tools of seduction designed to corrupt human women. For Tertullian, and the Watchers' crime was not merely the transmission of technology, but the deliberate weaponization of beauty. He described these angels as the corruptors of the human race, whose teachings led directly to the moral decay that necessitated the flood. Tertullian's writings reveal a church father who fully embraced the Enochic narrative and using it to condemn what he saw as contemporary decadence. However, not all church fathers accepted the Enochic tradition uncritically. By the 4th century, and figures like Augustine of Hippo began to offer alternative interpretations. Augustine and in the City of God, and rejected the idea that angels could physically mate with human women. He argued that the sons of God in Genesis 6 referred not to fallen angels, but to the righteous lineage of Seth intermarrying with the sinful line of Cain. This reinterpretation, and while distancing the church from the Watcher tradition, and inadvertently preserved the core theological problem. The boundary between divine and human had been violated. The early church fathers thus engaged in a complex negotiation. They accepted the Watchers as historical figures, but debated the nature of their crime and the extent of their influence. Justin and Irenaeus, and Tertullian saw them as the architects of pagan corruption and the source of forbidden knowledge. Augustine, and writing later, and sought to rationalize the narrative and stripping it of its more supernatural elements. The patristic period left the Watchers in a state of theological ambiguity. They were too central to the biblical narrative to ignore, and yet too problematic to fully embrace. The Church Fathers preserved the tradition, but reframed it within the context of Christian orthodoxy. The Watchers remained the fallen ones, the beings who had crossed a boundary and forever changed the course of human history, and their legacy debated by theologians for centuries to come. As the medieval church solidified its theological framework, and the ambiguous Watchers of the early church fathers underwent a profound transformation. They were no longer debated as ambiguous intermediaries between heaven and earth. Instead, they were systematically catalogued and ranked, and reclassified as demons within the emerging hierarchies of infernal power. The pivotal text in this transformation was the Ars Goetia, and the first book of the Lesser Key of Solomon, and a grimoire compiled in the 17th century, but drawing from medieval demonological traditions dating back to the 13th and 14th centuries. Within its pages, and the names of the Watchers were not erased, but repurposed. The archangels who once guarded over humanity became princes of hell. Consider the figure of Azazel. In the Book of Enoch, and Azazel was the Watcher who taught humanity the art of weaponry and metallurgy and cosmetics, knowledge deemed corrupting by the heavenly host. In the Ars Goetia, and Azazel is transformed into a duke of hell named Agaz, and who commands 31 legions, and is said to teach languages and cause earthquakes, and retrieve fugitives. The connection is not incidental. The grimoire preserves the Watcher's original attributes, knowledge and power over the earth, and the ability to corrupt, but reframes them within a Christian demonological system. Similarly, and the Watcher Shemihazah, and the leader of the 200 fallen angels, and appears in the Ars Goetia as the King Baal. Baal is described as ruling over 66 legions, and appearing with 3 heads, a cat and a toad, and a man, and possessing the power to make men invisible. The Watcher's original role as a leader who swore an oath to descend to earth is mirrored in Baal's status as a king among demons. The descent from heaven to hell is complete. Medieval demonologists did not merely rename the Watchers. They integrated them into a complex hierarchy that mirrored the celestial order. The Pseudomonarchia Daemonum, and written by the German physician and occultist Johann Weyer in 1563, and listed 69 demons, and many of whom bear the names and attributes of the Watchers. Weyer, a student of the occult, but also a critic of witch trials, and preserved the Enochic tradition in scholarly form. He classified demons by their sins and their powers, and their ranks, kings and dukes, marquises and presidents, all of which echo the original Watchers' roles as rulers over specific domains of forbidden knowledge. The theological implications were profound. by the late medieval period, and the Watchers were no longer seen as angels who fell through lust for human women. Instead, and they were recast as demons who actively sought to enslave humanity through false knowledge. The knowledge they imparted, astrology and alchemy, sorcery, was now classified as demonic magic and orgotia, and derived from the Greek word for sorcery. The very term used to describe the Watchers' teachings became synonymous with the practice of summoning and commanding demons. This reclassification served the Church's broader agenda. By demonizing the Watchers, and medieval theologians could simultaneously condemn the study of forbidden knowledge, while preserving the structure of angelic and demonic hierarchies. The Watchers became a cautionary tale. Even the most exalted angels could fall, and their knowledge, and once divine, and became a trap for the unwary. Yet the grimoires also preserved an important detail. In the Ars Goetia, and the demons are not simply evil. They are bound to the will of the summoner, and their power limited by the authority of King Solomon. This reflects the Enochic tradition, in which the Watchers are bound in the valleys of the earth until the final judgment. The medieval magician, and by invoking the names of these fallen angels, and claim to exercise the same authority over them that the archangels once wielded. The Watchers, and then, did not disappear from religious consciousness. They were absorbed and systematized, and assigned new roles within the demonological literature of the Middle Ages. Their fall from heaven was reinterpreted as a fall into the infernal ranks, and their forbidden knowledge recast as demonic temptation. But the core narrative remained intact. Beings of immense power and knowledge, and who crossed a boundary they should not have crossed, and whose legacy shaped the spiritual warfare of the medieval church. In the next chapter, and we will examine how Renaissance occultists, and including John Dee and Edward Kelly, and attempted to reclaim the Watchers' knowledge through angelic communication, and seeking to bypass the demonic taint medieval demonology had imposed. The grimoires of the late Middle Ages had chained the Watchers within the pages of demonology, but the Renaissance would witness a profound reclamation. The revival of Enochian traditions by occultists in the 16th century was not merely a continuation of medieval magic. It was an audacious attempt to bypass the corrupt hierarchies of fallen angels and establish direct communication with the Watchers themselves, and stripping away centuries of church-imposed condemnation. The pivotal figure in this revival was Dr. John Dee, a mathematician, astrologer, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I.D., was no superstitious peasant. He was one of the most learned men of his age, and a scholar of mathematics and astronomy and ancient languages. In 1581 and Dee began a series of scrying sessions with Edward Kelly, and a medium with a reputation for speaking with spirits. Their goal was nothing less than to recover the original and uncorrupted wisdom that Adam possessed before the fall. Wisdom they believed the Watchers had once transmitted to humanity. The spirits Kelly claimed to contact identified themselves as angels, but the names and attributes they revealed bore striking parallels to the Watchers of Enoch. The first spirit to appear was Uriel, and the angel who had guided Enoch through the heavenly realms. Over several years, and Kelly dated pages of complex angelic language, what they called the Enochian language, along with intricate sigils and tables and invocations. The system they produced was a complete cosmological framework. 49 angelic governors ruling over the world, and each corresponding to specific geographical regions and celestial bodies and spiritual powers. Crucially, and Dee and Kelly's Enochian system reclassified the Watchers not as demons to be bound, but as intermediaries between humanity and the divine. The spirits instructed Kelly that the 200 Watchers were not uniformly evil. They were a spectrum of beings, and some of whom had transgressed out of love for humanity and others out of rebellion. The Enochian calls, the prayers Kelly transcribed, were designed to invoke these beings with respect and not coercion, and a radical departure from the grimoire tradition of commanding demons with Solomon's seal. the Watchers and according to Dee's spirits, and had left behind a lost language that contained the keys to all knowledge, alchemy and astrology, medicine and prophecy, the Enochian tablets, and they claimed, and were fragments of the original language spoken before the Tower of Babel. Dee believed that by mastering this language, and he could restore humanity to its prelapsarian state, a direct echo of the Watcher's original gift of forbidden knowledge. This claim was met with intense skepticism. The Church condemned Dee's work as demonic, and rumors spread that Kelly was a charlatan. Yet the Enochian system survived and preserved in Dee's meticulous diaries. In the 19th century, and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn would resurrect Dee's Enochian magic, and treating the Watchers as powerful but neutral spirits to be invoked for wisdom and power. The Enochian calls became central rituals in Western occultism, and their strange and guttural syllables believed to resonate with the celestial spheres. The Renaissance revival of Enochian traditions fundamentally altered the perception of the Watchers. No longer merely fallen angels or ranked demons, and they became gatekeepers of a lost and golden age of human knowledge. The Watchers were reimagined as teachers who had been punished not for malice, but for their compassion in sharing divine secrets. This reinterpretation laid the groundwork for modern occult movements that view the Watchers as benevolent and, if dangerous, and sources of esoteric wisdom. Dee and Kelly's work remains controversial. Skeptics argue that the Enochian language is a product of Kelly's subconscious or outright fraud. Yet the system's internal consistency and its astronomical and mathematical precision, and its parallels to authentic Enochic texts, suggest a deeper source. Whether the spirits were real or psychological constructs, and the Enochian revival permanently inserted the Watchers into the vocabulary of Western esotericism, and transforming them from condemned rebels into the silent and waiting teachers of a forgotten age. The 19th century witnessed a radical reimagining of the Watchers, and not as fallen angels or demons, but as advanced spiritual beings guiding human evolution. This reinterpretation found its most influential expression in the writings of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, and co-founder of the Theosophical Society in 1875. Blavatsky's magnum opus and The Secret Doctrine 1888 drew upon ancient texts she claimed to have studied in Himalayan monasteries. She synthesized Hindu cosmology and Buddhist philosophy and fragments of Enochic literature into a grand narrative of cosmic cycles. In this framework, and the Watchers were not rebels, but members of a higher evolutionary wave, planetary spirits, or Dehayan Chohans, who voluntarily descended to assist nascent humanity. Theosophy's cosmology posited a sevenfold chain of worlds and races. According to Blavatsky, and the Watchers incarnated during the third, root race, of humanity, and a period when humans were still ethereal and lacked physical form. Their descent was not a fall from grace, but a sacrifice, a necessary intervention to accelerate human spiritual development. Blavatsky explicitly challenged the Judeo-Christian condemnation of the Watchers. She argued that the Book of Enoch had been corrupted by later church authorities who twisted the narrative to suppress ancient wisdom. In her view, and the Watchers' true crime was revealing the secret knowledge of the gods to mortals, and a transgression only in the eyes of a jealous priesthood. Theosophy also reinterpreted the Nephilim. Rather than monstrous giants, and Blavatsky described them as the giants of wisdom, beings of immense spiritual stature who became the first kings and sages of antiquity. She linked them to the kings of Edom mentioned in Genesis, and to the Rephaim of Canaanite texts, and which she saw as remnants of a pre-Adamite race of divine human hybrids. This reclamation extended to the Watchers' role in the fall of humanity. In theosophical thought, and the true fall was not a punishment for sin, but the descent of spirit into matter. The Watchers facilitated this descent, and enabling humans to develop physical bodies and individual consciousness. This was a necessary stage in the soul's journey toward eventual reunion with the divine. The Theosophical Society's influence spread rapidly and establishing branches in Europe and America and India. Its teachings permeated esoteric circles and inspiring later movements like the anthroposophy of Rudolf Steiner, and who described the Watchers as time spirits guiding cultural epochs. Steiner's 1909 lecture series and the Apocalypse of St. John and presented the Watchers as celestial beings who oversee the evolution of human consciousness through successive ages. Theosophy's reinterpretation of the Watchers as benevolent spiritual guides, rather than malevolent rebels, marked a decisive shift in Western esotericism. It removed the stigma of sin and punishment and replacing it with a narrative of cosmic evolution and divine compassion. The Watchers became archetypes of the wise teacher and the guardian of ancient knowledge, and the catalyst for human awakening. This vision persists in modern spiritual movements. New Age authors like Zecharia Sitchin would later adapt theosophical ideas and identifying the Watchers with the Anunnaki of Sumerian texts, extraterrestrial beings who genetically engineered humanity. Theosophy's influence is also evident in the modern Lightworker movement, and where the Watchers are invoked as ascended masters guiding humanity through a planetary shift in consciousness. Yet Theosophy's claims remain unverifiable. Blavatsky's sources, the stanzas of Zion, were never produced for scholarly examination. Critics accuse her of fabricating ancient texts to support her cosmology. Despite this, and her work permanently altered the cultural perception of the Watchers, and transforming them from fallen angels into planetary spirits whose sacrifice made human civilization possible. The Watchers, and in this modern theosophical framework, and are not beings to be feared or exorcised. They are the architects of human potential and the silent guardians who watch over the evolution of consciousness itself. Do you see the Watchers as fallen angels or ascended guides? Share your interpretation in the comments below. The theosophical reimagining of the Watchers as benevolent guides found its most influential secular air in the mid-20th century, and not in spiritualist circles, but in the emerging field of ufology. The narrative of celestial beings descending to Earth to impart forbidden knowledge and alter human genetics became a powerful template for interpreting the wave of reported flying saucer sightings that began in 1947. The connection was forged explicitly by George Hunt Williamson and a former anthropologist and contactee. In his 1953 book, Other Tongues, Other Flesh, and Williamson argued that the Watchers described in the Book of Enoch were not angels, but extraterrestrial visitors from other planets. He claimed these beings, and whom he called the Elder Race, had established colonies on Earth and interbred with early humans, and producing the hybrid giants known as the Nephilim. Williamson presented this as literal history and not allegory, and linked it directly to contemporary UFO contact claims. The Watchers, and he insisted, and were returning. This interpretation gained academic credibility through the work of Zecharia Sitchin, and whose series The Earth Chronicles, beginning in 1976, systematically mapped the Watchers onto the Sumerian pantheon. Sitchin, and a linguist, and argued that the Sumerian texts describing the Anunnaki, those who came from heaven to earth, were precise historical records. He identified the Watchers with the Anunnaki leader Enki and the god of wisdom, and who in Sumerian myth created humanity through genetic manipulation. Sitchin's reading of cuneiform tablets claimed that Enki and his sister Ninhursag spliced their own DNA with that of Homo erectus, and producing a hybrid worker species, the Nephilim, and in this framework, and were not monsters but master geneticists. Sitchin's work, and while rejected by mainstream archaeologists and linguists, and created a powerful bridge. The Watchers' act of teaching forbidden arts, metallurgy and cosmetics, astronomy, became the Anunnaki's program of technological uplift. The sons of God, who took human wives, became extraterrestrial astronauts who established breeding programs. The flood that destroyed the Nephilim became a nuclear catastrophe triggered by their wars. The genetic manipulation theme found its most explicit expression in the work of Jacques Vallée and the French astronomer and ufologist. In his 1979 book, Messengers of Deception, and Vallée proposed that the Watcher's narrative described a long-term and systematic intervention in human evolution. He argued that the fallen angels were not visitors, but a form of intelligence, perhaps non-human and perhaps extra-dimensional, that had been managing human development for millennia. The UFO phenomenon, and Vallée suggested, and was a modern manifestation of the same control system described in the Book of Enoch. The Watcher's UFO connection was further cemented by the 1973 publication of The Watchers by Raymond Drake, and an amateur historian, who argued that ancient astronauts had established a global network of bases and that the biblical Watchers were their overseers. Drake's work, and though speculative, and influenced a generation of ancient astronaut theorists who saw the Watchers as the original gods of every pantheon. By the 1990s, and the synthesis was complete, the Watchers were no longer fallen angels but extraterrestrial geneticists. The Nephilim were hybrids. The flood was a deliberate extinction event. The Book of Enoch was not religious scripture, but a historical record of alien contact. This framework has been popularized by the History Channel series Ancient Aliens, and which presents the Watchers as the central evidence for the ancient astronaut hypothesis. The modern ufological interpretation of the Watchers has profound implications. It transforms the narrative from a story of sin and punishment into one of technological intervention and species management. The Watchers are no longer rebels against divine order, but members of an advanced civilization conducting experiments on a developing world. The forbidden knowledge they imparted, writing and law, medicine, becomes the gift of a more advanced culture. The judgment of the flood becomes a cleanup operation. This reimagining has created a powerful mythology for the 21st century, and one that explains human origins not through divine creation or natural evolution alone, but through deliberate and repeated intervention by beings from elsewhere. The Watchers, and in this view, and are not fallen. They are our creators and our teachers, and our genetic ancestors. And their return, and as reported by contactees and abductees, and suggests that the experiment is not yet complete. The ancient narrative of the Watchers, and once confined to the crumbling pages of Epic Enoch and the commentaries of desert theologians, and has undergone a profound metamorphosis in the modern era. It has stepped out of the scriptorium and into the multiplex and the living room and the gaming console. This chapter surveys how the core mythos of divine beings who fell and who taught forbidden knowledge and who sired a race of giants has been adapted and distorted and reimagined by the engines of popular culture. The most direct and influential adaptation arrives in the long-running television series Supernatural 2005-2020. In its later seasons, and the show explicitly introduces the Grigori and the Greek term for the Watchers, the visual narration shifts from ancient scrolls to a dimly lit and modern warehouse. Here and the Watchers are no longer ethereal spirits or extraterrestrial geneticists. They are a secretive and bureaucratic order of angels who have remained on Earth for millennia and tasked with a single and cold mandate: observe and but never interfere. The show's depiction is a study in theological inversion. The Watchers are not fallen in the sense of moral corruption. They are fallen in the sense of being paralyzed by their own rulebook. They have witnessed genocide and famine and plague, and yet they do nothing. Their leader and Metatron is a petty and power-hungry scribe, and a far cry from the divine scribe of Enochic tradition. Supernatural transforms the Watchers from agents of cosmic rebellion into symbols of institutional apathy and a critique of divine silence in the face of human suffering. The Nephilim and their offspring and are presented as volatile and dangerous hybrids, and echoing the ancient terror of the giants, but now filtered through a lens of forbidden romance and tragic consequence. The cinematic landscape offers a more fragmented but equally potent and appropriation. In the 2014 film, Noah and director Darren Aronofsky presents the Watchers not as fallen angels, but as the Nephilim themselves, giants made of rock and light, and exiled from heaven for helping humanity. This is a significant departure from the source text. The film's Watchers are creatures of immense and tragic pity. They are trapped between the celestial and the terrestrial, and their bodies encrusted with stone as a punishment for their compassion. They aid Noah in building the ark, and a narrative choice that transforms them from corruptors into relunt saviors. The visual is striking. These are not the fierce and sun-bronzed giants of the ancient world, but crumbling and luminous golems. The film uses them to explore a central paradox of the Watcher myth. Were they benevolent guides or corrupting influences? Aronofsky's answer is ambiguous and suggesting that the line between help and hubris is dangerously thin. In the world of video games, and the Watchers have become a versatile trope. The Darksiders franchise presents the Watchers as a corrupt ruling council of angels who enforce a broken cosmic law, and often acting as antagonists to the game's protagonists. Here, and the theme of surveillance is literalized. The Watchers are spies and jailers, and their power derived from the information they control. This aligns with the ancient title Watchers, but recontextualizes it within a dystopian and post-apocalyptic framework. The Assassin's Creed series, and while not directly naming the Watchers, and employs a parallel mythology of the Isu, a precursor race of beings who created humanity and were worshipped as gods. The Isu's fall and their forbidden knowledge, and their hybrid offspring, directly mirror the Enochic narrative, and demonstrating how the Watcher template has become a foundational structure for science fiction world building. The most pervasive, and if subtle, an influence is on the figure of the fallen angel itself. The specific idea that a faction of angels fell not for lust, but for the crime of teaching knowledge, the secret arts of metallurgy and cosmetics, astronomy and divination, is a uniquely Enochic concept. This Promethean angel, and who brings fire to humanity, and is now a staple of fantasy literature, and from the works of Neil Gaiman to the Hellboy comics. The Watchers have been secularized. They are no longer beings of sin, but archetypes of rebellion and progress, and forbidden science. The journey of the Watchers from the Book of Enoch to the modern screen is a story of continuous reinterpretation. Popular culture has stripped away the ancient theological anxieties about purity and hybridity, and replacing them with modern concerns. The ethics of intervention, and the burden of knowledge, and the loneliness of immortality, and the corrupting nature of power. The Watchers have become a mirror, and reflecting not the fears of an ancient scribe, but the anxieties of a contemporary audience. They are no longer just the ones who watch. They are the ones we watch, and endlessly refracted through our own cultural lens. This is not merely poetry. A cubit measures approximately 18 inches. 300 cubits equals 450 feet. These beings were not simply large humans. The text specifies a distinct species, a hybrid offspring resulting from the union of divine Watchers and human women. The mechanics of this hybridization appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The language suggests deliberate genetic manipulation and not mere procreation. The Watchers, and according to these texts, and possessed knowledge of life's fundamental codes, knowledge they were forbidden to share. Ancient Mesopotamian cylinder seals provide visual evidence. The British Museum holds a seal from 2200 BCE depicting a figure twice the height of surrounding humans and with distinct facial features, elongated skull and almond-shaped eyes, and a physique that defies normal human proportions. This is not artistic license. Similar depictions appear across Sumerian and Akkadian and Babylonian artifacts, and consistently showing hybrid beings with characteristics that modern geneticists would recognize as interspecies traits. The Sumerian king list records 8 antediluvian rulers with reign lengths ranging from 18,600 to 43,200 years. Historians have dismissed these as mythological exaggeration, but geneticists studying mitochondrial DNA now identify a bottleneck event approximately 10,000 years ago, and where human genetic diversity suddenly collapsed. The population of breeding humans dropped to fewer than 10,000 individuals. The Sumerian texts describe this exact period as the time when the Watchers descended and the Nephilim appeared. This ecological collapse matches the archaeological record. At sites like Göbekli Tepe, and constructed 11,000 years ago, and massive T-shaped limestone pillars weigh up to 20 tons each, mainstream archaeology cannot explain how hunter-gatherers moved these stones. The Watcher narrative offers a different explanation. These structures were built by hybrid beings with enhanced physical capabilities. Cryptozoologists have documented persistent reports of giant humanoid remains. In 1895, and the New York Times reported the discovery of a 14-foot skeleton in West Virginia. In 1931, and a 12-foot skeleton was unearthed in the Humboldt Lake bed of Nevada. The Smithsonian Institution allegedly confiscated both. The Watcher narrative provides context. These are not isolated anomalies, but the last remnants of a hybrid bloodline that the Hebrew Bible commands be exterminated. The genetic component becomes explicit in the Zohar and the foundational text of Jewish mysticism. The Zohar calls this the Great Mingling, and warns that the resulting hybrid genome corrupted the entire human bloodline. Modern genetic research has identified Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA in modern humans. These ancient hominids possessed larger skulls and greater muscle mass, and cognitive abilities that exceed modern humans in certain areas. The Watcher narrative suggests these were not natural species, but engineered hybrids, the Nephilim and their descendants. The Book of Giants, and found at Qumran, and describes the Nephilim having dreams of their own destruction. One giant named Ohir sees a tablet being submerged in water. Another sees a garden with trees being cut down. These are not merely prophetic nightmares. They are the genetic memory of a species that knew it could not survive. The flood narrative, and in this context, and becomes a biological reset, a deliberate extinction of a hybrid genome that threatened the human species. This precise time frame, approximately 1,750 years, corresponds to the period from the flood to the rise of King David. The Hebrew Bible records that David encountered a giant named Goliath, and whose height was 6 cubits and a span, roughly 9 feet and 9 inches. The biblical text emphasizes that Goliath had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, and genetic markers of a distinct bloodline. The Watcher narrative and examined through the lens of genetics and archaeology, and presents a coherent hypothesis. Humanity was once the subject of a deliberate genetic intervention. The Nephilim were the result. Their destruction was not punishment, but quarantine, and their genetic legacy, and according to the texts, and persists to this day. While the Book of Enoch preserves a Hebrew tradition of angelic rebellion, and a parallel structure exists within Zoroastrianism and the ancient Persian faith that predates and likely influenced post-exilic Judaism. The Zoroastrian cosmic drama divides the spiritual world into 2 warring camps: the Asatars, benevolent beings worthy of worship, and the Devas, deceptive entities who chose evil. The Watcher's narrative finds its closest Zoroastrian analogue in the figure of Angra Mainyu and the destructive spirit. According to the Bundahishan and a 9th century CE compilation of older Zoroastrian cosmology, and Angra Mainyu was not created evil, but chose rebellion. He dwelt in the primordial darkness for 3,000 years before assaulting the good creation of Ahura Mazda. This mirrors the Watcher's 1,750-year imprisonment. Both narratives feature a period of confinement before a final confrontation. More specifically, and the Watchers who descended to Mount Hermon correspond to a class of Yazatars who fell from their station. The Vidvdad, and a key Zoroastrian text, and describes how the Devas were originally celestial beings who chose the lie, Draugr. They did not merely rebel in heaven. They descended to Earth and actively corrupted humanity by introducing forbidden knowledge. This directly parallels the Watcher's curriculum in 1 Enoch 8, and where Azazel teaches metallurgy for weapons and Shemihazah teaches enchantments. The Zoroastrian texts add a specific detail. The Devas also introduced the practice of consuming intoxicating drinks and eating carrion, ritual impurities that defiled the human body and weakened its spiritual connection to the divine. The offspring of the Watchers, the Nephilim, find their counterpart in the Maria and/or evil creations of the Devas. The Bundahishan describes how Angra Mainyu created a race of monstrous beings called the Craftstra, and which included giants Mazen who were tall as 7 reeds and possessed supernatural strength. These beings, unlike the Nephilim, and were hybrids. They were born from the union of devas with human women. The Zoroastrian solution to this genetic corruption mirrors the flood narrative. In the Yashts, and the deity Mithra is described as wielding a mace of 1,000 knobs to smite the devas and their offspring. But the primary cleansing came through a cosmic winter rather than a flood. The Bundahishan recounts that Ahura Mazda sent a great cold that froze the world and destroying the giant races and purifying the earth. This aligns with the Watcher's tradition. The flood was not punishment alone, but biological reset. Crucially, and Zoroastrianism preserves a memory of these fallen beings being chained. The Yasna 30, and one of the oldest Zoroastrian hymns, and declares that the Devas were bound in fetters for their rebellion. The Bundahishan specifies that Angra Mainyu and his host were confined to the darkness of the abyss until the final renovation of the world, a 9,000-year imprisonment that echoes the Watcher's binding in the valleys of the earth. This Zoroastrian framework suggests that the Watcher's tradition was not isolated to Hebrew scripture, but part of a broader ancient, Near Eastern understanding of a primordial angelic rebellion. The Devas were not mere demons. They were fallen Yazatas, beings who once served the divine order but chose to descend and teach forbidden arts and interbreed with humanity. Their legacy, and in both traditions, and was a corrupted world that required a cataclysmic reset. The narrative of celestial beings descending to bestow forbidden knowledge upon humanity is not confined to the ancient Near East. In the mountainous landscapes and island archipelagos of the Aegean, and a parallel mythology emerged, one that the Greeks encoded in their own pantheon. The figure who bridges the Watchers of Enoch and the Hellenic world is the Titan Prometheus. The evidence lies in the etymology and the crime. This aligns precisely with the Watcher Shemihazah, and who, according to the Book of Enoch, and hesitated before descending and aware of the divine punishment that awaited. Both figures acted with premeditated knowledge of the consequences. Prometheus did not merely steal fire from the forge of Hephaestus. Ancient texts, and particularly Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days, and describe a more comprehensive transgression. Prometheus taught humanity the arts of civilization, architecture and astronomy, writing and medicine, and the interpretation of omens. This catalogue of knowledge is a direct parallel to the 200 Watchers who taught metallurgy and cosmetics, astrology, and the signs of the earth. In both traditions, and the gift was not neutral, it was a violation of a cosmic boundary. The archaeological record reinforces this connection. On the slopes of Mount Kazbek in the Caucasus Mountains, and a site the ancient Greeks called the Rock of Prometheus, explorers have identified petroglyphs dating to the 2nd millennium BCE. These carvings depict a bound figure, arms outstretched and chained to a cliff face, while a massive eagle tears at his torso. The iconography is identical to later depictions of the Watchers in chains, and as described in the Book of Enoch, and where they are bound in the valleys of the earth, until the day of judgment. The Caucasus region, and a geographical corridor between Mesopotamia and the Black Sea, and served as a cultural bridge. The Prometheus myth likely absorbed elements of the older Watcher tradition as it traveled west. The punishment itself carries the same theological weight. Prometheus was sentenced to an eternity of torment for his philanthropy. Each day and his liver, the organ the ancients believed housed human emotion and foresight, was devoured, and only to regenerate overnight. This cyclical agony mirrors the Watcher's fate, imprisoned in darkness and forced to witness the destruction of their hybrid offspring and the Nephilim, and in the Great Flood. Neither Prometheus nor the Watchers were destroyed. They were preserved as eternal examples of transgression. The giants and two find their Greek counterpart. The Nephilim, the corrupted offspring of the Watchers and human women, are mirrored in the giants of Greek myth. These were not mere monsters, but beings of immense size and power, and born from the blood of the castrated sky god Uranus when it fell upon the earth. They waged war against the Olympian gods, and a conflict known as the Gigantomachy. The parallels are striking. Hybrid progeny and born of a celestial and terrestrial union, and who bring chaos and require divine intervention to be subdued. The Greek myth, unlike the Hebrew, and ends with these giants being buried beneath mountains or volcanic islands, and their bones said to be the source of earthquakes. The theological implication is that the Watcher tradition represents a foundational Indo-European archetype. The figure of the rebellious benefactor, the being who defies divine order to elevate humanity, appears in Persia with the Yazatas who became divas, and in Greece with Prometheus, and in Canaan with the Beni Elohim. The Watchers are not an isolated anomaly. They are the Semitic iteration of a universal narrative. The fear that knowledge is once given and cannot be taken back, and that the beings who grant it are forever bound by the consequences of their generosity. The Watcher narrative does not belong solely to the Old World. Across the Atlantic, and indigenous peoples of North America preserved their own accounts of celestial beings who descended to earth and took human wives, and imparted forbidden knowledge. These traditions are encoded in oral histories and petroglyphs, and present a striking parallel to the Book of Enoch, suggesting the Watcher archetype is a global phenomenon. Among the Hopi of the American Southwest, and the oral tradition speaks of the Kachinas, not the masked dancers of modern ceremony, but the original Kachinas, star beings who came from the heavens, according to Hopi elders, and these beings arrived during the Third World, and a time before the current Fourth World. They taught the Hopi ancestors agriculture and astronomy, and the sacred ceremonies necessary for spiritual survival. But they also intermarried with human women. The offspring of these unions were giants, and known as the Mahu, and who possessed great strength and knowledge, but became corrupt. The Hopi accounts describe these giants as having a single eye in the center of their forehead, a detail that echoes the Cyclops of Greek myth and the Watcher's hybrid offspring, and the Nephilim. The Hopi word Kachina translates to life-bringer or spirit-father. Yet the same tradition warns that not all Kachinas were benevolent. Some taught warfare and sorcery, and leading to a great destruction by flood, the same flood that, and in the Enochian narrative, and ended the age of the Watchers. Further north, and the Ojibwe and other Algonquian peoples tell of the Wendigo, not a single monster, but a class of giant and cannibalistic beings born from the union of sky spirits and human women. The Wendigo are described as towering figures, and their hearts made of ice and insatiable for human flesh. The Ojibwe shamanic tradition records that these beings were once sky teachers, but their corruption came from their refusal to leave the human world after their purpose was fulfilled. They lingered and took wives, and taught forbidden rites. The punishment: they were bound beneath the earth and their hearts frozen, a parallel to the Watchers chained in darkness. The Lakota and other plains tribes preserve the story of the star people, the witch harpy Oid, who descended on beams of light. They taught the Lakota the sacred calendar and the medicine wheel and the art of healing. Yet they also fathered children with human women. These hybrid offspring, and called the Iktomi in some traditions, and were tricksters, beings of immense intelligence but no moral compass. They introduced conflict and jealousy and the misuse of sacred knowledge. The Lakota elders recount that the Star people were eventually sealed in a cave beneath the Black Hills, and a prison from which they cannot escape until the end of this world. Archaeological evidence supports these oral traditions. In the American Southwest, and petroglyphs at sites like Chaco Canyon and Canyon de Chelly depict humanoid figures with elongated heads and star-like halos. These figures are often shown descending from the sky and interacting with smaller human figures, and in some cases, and coupling with them. The Anasazi, the ancient ones, left behind skeletal remains of unusually tall individuals, and some reaching 7 feet in height, and with cranial deformations consistent with the elongated skulls depicted in the art. While mainstream archaeology attributes these to cradleboarding, and indigenous elders maintain these were the bones of the Mahu, the giant offspring of the star beings. The Hopi word for the Watchers is Parchuwakatsi, the water beings who came from the stars. They are said to have arrived during a time when the earth was covered in water, and a direct parallel to the Watchers' descent at the time of the antediluvian world. The Hopi prophecy states that the Watchers will return when the fourth world ends, and signaling a final judgment. This mirrors the Enochian prophecy of the Watchers' release at the end of days. The cross-cultural consistency is undeniable. From the Hopi Kachinas to the Ojibwe Wendigo to the Lakota Star people, and the narrative remains identical. Celestial beings descend and teach forbidden knowledge and intermarry with humans and produce hybrid giants, and are punished by imprisonment or flood. The indigenous traditions of North America do not merely parallel the Watcher myth. They confirm it as a universal memory, and encoded in the bedrock of human civilization long before any written text. The Watcher narrative finds its most complex parallel in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, and where the concept of fallen divine beings is encoded in the mythology of the Asuras. Unlike the singular rebellion of the Watchers, and the Asura fall is cyclical, and a cosmic drama of devolution repeated across epochs known as yugas. In the Rig Veda and the oldest of Hindu scriptures, and the Asuras were originally the equals of the Devas, the shining gods. Both were born from the same cosmic source and Prajapati. The Asuras, however, possessed the divine knowledge of Maya, the power of illusion and material creation. A critical turning point occurred when they began to misuse this knowledge. They became intoxicated by their own power and seeking dominion over the 3 worlds rather than cosmic balance. This mirrors the Watchers' transgression. The Asuras descended from the celestial realms to interfere with the material plane. But there is a crucial distinction. The Watchers fell due to lust for human women. The Asuras fell due to spiritual pride, a corruption of consciousness rather than carnal desire. They represent the intellect divorced from wisdom. The Bhagavata Purana describes the Asura Hiranyakashipu, and who performed severe austerities to gain power, and then declared himself the supreme god and forbidding worship of Vishnu. His son and Prahlada remained a devotee. This is the same pattern. The father and a fallen being of immense power and opposes the divine order. The son represents the remnant of true knowledge. The story culminates in Vishnu's half-man and half-lion avatar and Narasimha emerging from a pillar to destroy the tyrant. The pillar itself is significant. It suggests the boundary between worlds and much like the barrier the Watchers breached. Moving eastward into Buddhist cosmology, and the narrative transforms further. The Aganya Sutta offers a startlingly direct parallel. The Buddha describes beings who originally lived in a realm of pure light and feeding on rapture. Over time, they descended to earth and began consuming a substance called rasa, a primordial cream that formed on the surface of the waters. As they ate, their luminous bodies became coarse and their light dimmed, and they developed gender differences. This consumption of forbidden substance is the Buddhist equivalent of the Watchers teaching humanity the forbidden arts of metallurgy and cosmetics. These beings are now trapped in physical form and began to hoard resources. They created boundaries and property and eventually kingship. The Buddha identifies the first king and Mahasamata as the one appointed by the people to punish wrongdoing. This is not a fall of angels in the Western sense, but a gradual densification of consciousness, a descent from formless light to flesh and driven by craving. The most direct Watcher analogue in Buddhist tradition is the figure of Mara and the tempter. Mara was once a high deva in the heaven of controlling others' creations. He fell not through sexual transgression, but through attachment to his own realm. He now obstructs enlightenment and tempting ascetics with visions of power and desire. When the Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree and Mara sent his daughters, named Desire and Discontent and Craving, to seduce him. This is the Watcher temptation inverted. The fallen being tries to prevent liberation and not grant forbidden knowledge. Archaeological evidence from the Swat Valley in Pakistan reveals stone carvings from the 2nd century BCE depicting Mara's army as hybrid creatures, half human and half beast, wielding weapons of chaos. These are the asuras of Buddhist art, and often shown in battle with the enlightened beings. Their iconography is consistent. They are larger than humans and dark-skinned, with exaggerated features and weapons of destruction. The Manusmriti and the ancient legal text and describes the asuras as beings who rejected the Vedic sacrifices. They built their own cities in the sky and made of gold and silver and iron, a direct echo of the Watchers teaching metallurgy. These cities were destroyed by the gods, and just as the Watchers were imprisoned. In the later Puranic literature, and the Asura Bali is a complex figure. He conquered the heavens through righteous means, but was tricked by Vamana and the dwarf avatar of Vishnu, and into surrendering his dominion. This narrative introduces moral ambiguity. Not all fallen beings are purely evil. Some, unlike Bali, and are noble but deluded and ruling the underworld with justice. This reflects a nuanced understanding of the fall. It is not permanent damnation, but a cycle of descent and potential return. The Vedic cosmology, and with its 4 yugas and or ages, and describes a progressive decline from a golden age of purity to the current Kali Yuga, an age of darkness and fragmentation. The Asuras are most active in the Kali Yuga, and when the barrier between realms is thinnest. This is the same pattern as the Watchers. Their interference accelerates human decline, and their presence is most felt in the final age before cosmic renewal. The visual evidence from the Ellora caves in Maharashtra shows Asura warriors carved into the rock, and their faces contorted with rage, and their bodies covered in ornaments of war. They are depicted as teachers of forbidden arts, alchemy and warfare, and sorcery. The caves and dating to the 6th century CE, and preserve a tradition of fallen beings that predates and parallels the Book of Enoch. In these traditions, and the Watchers are not a single event, but a recurring phenomenon, a cosmic pattern of beings who choose material power over spiritual unity, and in doing so, and shape the destiny of humanity through their fall. The theological pivot from a cyclical fall to a singular and historical catastrophe represents one of the most profound shifts in Western religious consciousness. The Watchers' narrative, and preserved in the Book of the Watchers within 1 Enoch, and provides the crucial missing link between the Edenic fall of Adam and the universal corruption that necessitated the flood. This intermediary catastrophe fundamentally reshaped early Christian understandings of sin itself. The Septuagint translators, and working in Alexandria around the 3rd century BCE, and made a telling lexical choice. When rendering Genesis chapter 6 verse 1 through 4, and they translated the Hebrew Nephilim, the fallen ones, as gigants, but more significantly, and they translated the sons of God, Beni Har Elohim, as angeloi and or angels. This was not mere translation. It was theological interpretation. The Greek-speaking Jewish community in Alexandria was actively synthesizing their ancestral traditions with Hellenistic concepts of intermediary beings and creating the conceptual framework that would later underpin Christian angelology and demonology. The early church fathers grappled intensely with the Watchers' tradition. Justin Martyr, and writing in the 2nd century CE, and explicitly identified the fallen angels as the source of pagan mythology. In his second apology, and he argued that the Watchers, and having fathered the Nephilim, and also taught humanity the arts of astrology and magic, and divination. These arts, and he claimed, and were not neutral knowledge, but corrupted gifts that bound humanity to demonic influence. The original sin of Eden, disobedience, was thus compounded by the Watchers' sin of forbidden revelation and creating a double corruption. Humanity's will was broken, and their knowledge was poisoned. Tertullian, and the North African theologian, writing around 200 CE, and took this synthesis further. In his treatise on the veiling of virgins, and he explicitly connected the Watchers' lust for human women to the doctrine of original sin. The angels, and he argued, and were attracted not merely by physical beauty, but by the cosmetic arts that humanity had developed after the fall. This created a feedback loop of corruption. Human sin attracted angelic sin, and which in turn deepened human corruption. Tertullian's argument reveals a crucial theological development. Sin was no longer merely an act, but a transmitted condition, and a hereditary stain passed through the very act of procreation that the Watchers had corrupted. The 4th century theologian Athanasius of Alexandria, and in his On the Incarnation, and reframed the Watchers' narrative within Christological terms. He argued that the corruption introduced by the Watchers was so profound that humanity could not redeem itself. The Watchers, and being immortal spirits, and had introduced a deathless corruption into the mortal realm. Only an immortal being who could take on mortality, the incarnate Word, could break this cycle. This theological move transformed the Watchers from a curious apocryphal detail into a necessary precondition for the incarnation itself. The archaeological evidence from the Qumran caves, and discovered in 1947, and has revolutionized understanding of this theological development. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls and multiple Aramaic manuscripts of 1 Enoch were found, and including the Book of the Watchers. These texts and dating from the 3rd to 1st centuries BCE and reveal a Jewish community that treated the Watchers' narrative as authoritative scripture. The Qumran community, and likely the Essenes and Saw themselves, as living in the final days of the Watchers' corruption and awaiting the ultimate judgment. Their rigorous purity laws and their separation from the temple establishment and their apocalyptic expeditions all stemmed from this Watchers-based worldview. The Genesis Apocryphon and another Qumran text, and expands the Watchers' narrative in revealing ways. It describes Noah's birth with luminous skin and radiant eyes, and causing his father Lamech to suspect angelic paternity. This anxiety about corrupted bloodlines reveals a deep theological concern. If the Watchers had contaminated human genetics, and how could a pure Messiah arise? The Qumran community's answer was that God had preserved a remnant line and culminating in the messianic Son of Man figure described in the Enochic parables. The Church Father Augustine of Hippo, and writing in the early 5th century, and would ultimately reject the Watchers' explanation for original sin. In the City of God, and he argued that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were not angels, but the righteous line of Seth, and who had intermarried with the corrupt line of Cain. This reinterpretation served Augustine's theological purposes. By locating the origin of corruption solely in human free will, and he preserved the doctrine of individual responsibility. Yet the Watchers' tradition persisted in Eastern Christianity and in Ethiopian Orthodoxy, and in various heterodox Christian movements. The Watchers' narrative thus represents a fork in the theological road. One path led to Augustine's doctrine of original sin as inherited guilt from Adam alone. The other path, and preserved in the Enochic tradition, and saw human corruption as compounded by angelic transgression. This latter view offered a more complex theology of evil, and one that acknowledged cosmic dimensions of corruption beyond individual human choice. The question remains, which path better accounts for the persistence of evil in human history? The Watcher's narrative, and when examined through the lens of feminist theology, and reveals a profound and often overlooked dimension: the complete silencing of the female voice at the moment of transgression. The text of 1 Enoch describes the angels taking wives, but the women themselves are never named and never quoted and never given agency. They exist only as objects of desire and as vessels for corruption and as mothers of monsters. Feminist theologians argue that this narrative framework establishes a dangerous theological precedent. The women in the Watcher's story are blamed for the angels' fall, not through their actions, but through their very existence as objects of male desire. The text states that the angels saw that they were beautiful, and this act of seeing is presented as the catalyst for cosmic corruption. The woman's body becomes the site of sin, and even though she has no choice in the matter, the Septuagint translation of Genesis chapter 6 verse 1 through 4 intensifies this problem. Where the Hebrew text says the sons of God saw the daughters of men, the Greek translation uses a verb that implies not just seeing, but gazing with lustful intent. The women are reduced to passive objects of a gaze that is inherently predatory. Yet in later theological interpretations, and particularly within the patristic tradition, and the blame shifts entirely to the women. Tertullian, and writing in the late 2nd century, and explicitly argues that women must cover their heads, because it was their beauty that caused the angels to fall. The sin of the Watchers becomes, and in his logic, and a sin of female temptation. This interpretation has profound implications for the history of Christian theology. The Watcher's narrative becomes a proof text for the inherent danger of female beauty, and for the necessity of female modesty, and for the idea that women bear a unique responsibility for male sin. The women of the Watcher's story are never given the chance to refuse. They are never asked if they consent. Their silence in the text becomes a theological weapon used against real women for centuries. The Qumran community, and which preserved the most complete copies of 1 Enoch, and took this logic to its extreme. The Damascus document, and a foundational text of the community, and explicitly links the Watcher's sin to the pollution of the priesthood through improper marriage. For the Qumran Syrians, and the Watcher's transgression was not just sexual, it was a violation of sacred boundaries. The angels had crossed the line between heaven and earth, and the women had become the conduit for that corruption. The community's obsession with purity laws and strict endogamy can be traced directly to this reading of the Watcher's story. Feminist scholars also note the striking absence of any female divine figure in the Watcher's narrative. In the ancient, Near Eastern context from which the story emerged, and goddesses played central roles in cosmogonic myths, the Sumerian goddess Inanna and the Akkadian Ishtar, and the Canaanite Asherah all had active roles in shaping the world and mediating between heaven and earth. The Watcher's story, and by contrast, presents a purely masculine divine realm. The angels are male. The god they rebel against is male. The women are mere objects. This reflects the patriarchal restructuring of Israelite religion, and which systematically suppressed female deities and female agency. The feminist critique extends to the very structure of the Watcher's myth. The narrative follows a pattern common to patriarchal societies. A male transgression is blamed on female presence. The angels could not have sinned if the women had not been beautiful. The flood could not have been necessary if the women had not given birth to giants. The women become the scapegoats for a cosmic catastrophe they had no power to prevent. Yet some feminist theologians have attempted to reclaim the Watcher's story from a different angle. They point out that the women and those silent and are also victims. They are taken by angels who possess supernatural power and authority. The women have no more agency than the earth itself, and which is also described as being corrupted by the angels' actions. In this reading, and the Watcher's narrative becomes a story about the violation of the feminine, both human and cosmic, by masculine power that has overstepped its bounds. The Watchers in feminist theology thus reveal a narrative of profound ambivalence. The story can be read as a justification for patriarchal control, and/or as a warning about the consequences of male violence. The women remain silent, but their silence speaks of a cosmic injustice that the text itself cannot fully contain. The Watchers do not merely corrupt the antediluvian world, they define its chronological end. Within this framework, and the Watchers are not a random rebellion, but the precise mechanism that triggers the first major epoch of judgment, the Apocalypse of Weeks, and preserved in the Ethiopic text of 1 Enoch chapter 93 verse 1 through 10, and chapter 91 verse 11 through 17, and presents history as a divinely ordained progression. The first week begins with Enoch's own birth. However, and it is the second week that witnesses the critical event, the descent of the Watchers. The text states that during this week, deceit and violence will spring up, and a man will seek salvation, a clear reference to Noah. The Watchers' arrival thus initiates the period of corruption that necessitates the flood and positioning their transgression as the fulcrum upon which the entire apocalyptic timeline pivots. Scholars analyzing the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments of the Apocalypse of Weeks, and particularly 4 Ken Sup G/Sup and 4 Ken Sup C/Sup, note the calendrical precision of this schema. The weeks are not metaphorical. They represent fixed periods of cosmic history. The Watchers' fall, and therefore, is not a past event with merely moral implications. It is a structural component of a divine countdown and a clock that began ticking when the angels descended upon Mount Hermon, the third week, and according to this schema, and is the period of the flood, the direct consequence of the Watchers' actions. The fourth week sees the giving of the law to Moses, and a corrective revelation meant to guide humanity away from the path the Watchers established. The subsequent weeks trace Israel's history through the monarchy and the exile and the return. The seventh week witnesses the rise of a chosen righteous group, and likely the Qumran community themselves, and who understood their own time as the culmination of this apocalyptic schedule. Crucially, and the 8th through 10th weeks describe the final judgment and the destruction of evil, and the creation of a new heaven and earth. The Watchers are explicitly named as subjects of this judgment. The text declares that in the 10th week, the first heaven shall pass away, and a new heaven shall appear, and all powers of evil, and including the fallen angels, and will be condemned to the abyss of fire. This schema reveals a profound theological shift. The Watchers are not merely criminals to be punished. They are agents whose rebellion sets the stage for the entire drama of redemption. Their sin creates the problem that the rest of history must solve. Without the Watchers, and there is no need for the flood, and no need for the law, and no need for the final judgment. They are the necessary antagonist in a cosmic narrative of salvation. Archaeological evidence from Qumran supports this interpretation. The community rule and the Damascus document echo the Apocalypse of Weeks language and describing the present age as the time when the angels of destruction hold sway. The community saw itself as living in the final days of the 7th week and awaiting the judgment of the Watchers and their human offspring. Cross-referencing with other ancient Near Eastern texts reveals similar chronological frameworks. The Sumerian king list, and with its antediluvian rulers reigning for tens of thousands of years, and also divides history into distinct epochs before the flood. The Watcher's narrative, and however, infuses this structure with moral and cosmic significance. The Apocalypse of Weeks transforms a simple chronology into a theology of history, and where each week brings humanity closer to the divine resolution. The Watchers, and therefore, are not just figures of ancient myth. They are the hinge upon which the apocalyptic view of time turns. Their descent to Mount Hermon was not a fall from grace alone. It was the event that fractured history into before and after, and creating the framework within which all subsequent prophecy and judgment must be understood. The Apocalypse of Weeks makes their role explicit. They are the architects of the age of corruption, and their judgment is the necessary prelude to the age of restoration. The timeline of salvation depends upon their transgression. The caves of Qumran, and overlooking the Dead Sea's salt-encrusted shore, and yielded more than the biblical manuscripts that would reshape modern scholarship. Among the hundreds of scrolls hidden in clay jars for nearly 2 millennia, and the community's scribes preserved a theological obsession. The Watchers, but these were not the brief and oblique references of Genesis. The Qumran library contained entire works dedicated to analyzing their rebellion and their progeny, and their cosmic significance. The most remarkable of these is the Book of Giants, and preserved in fragments across multiple caves. Unlike the more familiar Book of Enoch, and this text focuses not on the Watchers themselves, but on their offspring, the Nephilim. The fragments describe these giants as named individuals, Ohir and Hahir, and the most powerful among them, and Gilgamesh. The inclusion of this Mesopotamian hero king is no accident. The Qumran scribes were deliberately connecting their theological history to the broader ancient, Near Eastern tradition, and suggesting the Watchers' influence extended far beyond Hebrew scripture. The Book of Giants presents a haunting narrative. The giants, and having consumed all human food and livestock, and begin to devour one another. They experience terrifying dreams, a garden with trees being cut down, and a tablet being submerged in water. The giant Ohir recounts these visions to the other Watchers, and who send their leader Mahawai on a perilous journey to consult the ancient scribe Enoch. Enoch, and dwelling in paradise, and interprets the dreams as prophecies of the coming flood, a judgment that will destroy the giants and imprison their fathers. These fragments reveal a theological sophistication previously unsuspected. The Qumran community viewed the Watchers not merely as fallen angels, but as the origin of forbidden knowledge. A text known as the Genesis Apocrypha expands on this theme. It describes how the Watcher Barakiel taught humanity astrology, and Kokabeel imparted the secrets of constellations, and Penemu instructed mankind in writing. The very skill the Qumran scribes were using to copy these texts. There is profound irony here. The community that preserved these scrolls was condemning the knowledge their own work required. The Damascus document, and a foundational text of the Qumran community, and explicitly warns against the Watchers' legacy. The Watchers serve as the ultimate cautionary tale, beings of immense power who abandon their divine station for forbidden union with human women. The document applies this lesson directly to the community's own members, and warning that intermarriage with outsiders would repeat the Watchers' sin. Perhaps most significant is the Book of Jubilees, and multiple copies of which were found at Qumran. This text provides a precise chronology of the Watchers' fall. It dates their descent to the Jubilee of the year 1205 from creation, and exactly 120 years before the flood. The Watchers, and the text explains, and were sent to earth to teach humanity righteousness. Instead, and they were corrupted by human beauty, a tragic inversion of their original mission. Their leader, Master Satan, is permitted to retain 1/10 of the imprisoned Watchers' power to test humanity, and creating a permanent struggle between divine law and demonic influence. The Qumran community saw themselves living in the final generation before judgment, a time parallel to the Watchers' own era. Their war scroll describes an apocalyptic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, the latter including the spirits of the Watchers' offspring. The community's celibate lifestyle and their strict purity laws, and their separation from Jerusalem's temple all reflected their conviction that the Watchers' sin, the mingling of the holy with the profane, must never be repeated. The Dead Sea Scrolls thus transform the Watchers from distant mythological figures into a present theological reality. For the Qumran community, and every sunrise brought the possibility that the Watchers' judgment was imminent. Their library of fragments, the Book of Giants, and the Genesis Apocrypha, and the Damascus document, represents a sustained meditation on how divine beings could fall and how humanity might avoid their fate. The Watchers were not merely ancient rebels. They were a mirror held up to the human condition itself. The ancient texts of Qumran and sealed for 2 millennia and have found an unexpected resonance in the digital age. The narrative of the Watchers, angelic beings who descended and imparted forbidden knowledge and fathered a hybrid race, has been repurposed as a foundational myth for modern conspiracy theories. These theories, and while lacking direct archaeological support, and draw heavily on the themes of hidden knowledge and elite control present in the Enochic tradition. The core of the modern adaptation lies in the concept of a hidden hand guiding human civilization. Proponents argue that the knowledge taught by the Watchers, metallurgy and cosmetics, astrology and writing, did not disappear with the flood. Instead, and they claim it was preserved by a secret lineage and a brotherhood of the serpent, or a Watcher bloodline, that has manipulated global events ever since. This narrative directly mirrors the Book of the Watchers, and where the fallen angels create a hierarchical system of knowledge, and with the elite few, the Nephilim and their offspring, wielding power over the masses. Visual narration, a split screen. On the left, a weathered image of an ancient Mesopotamian cylinder seal and showing a figure in a horned headdress and a standard depiction of a deity or semi-divine being. On the right, a modern graphic of the Illuminati pyramid on the US $1 bill and with the all-seeing eye at its apex. The camera slowly zooms in on the eye and then dissolves to a desert landscape at dawn and focusing on the silhouette of a single and massive standing stone. The specific, forbidden knowledge of the Watchers is recategorized in these theories. The teaching of Azazel, the art of weaponry and adornment, is seen as the origin of military-industrial complexes and the fashion and beauty industries, and both tools for controlling populations. The teaching of Shemihazah, the secrets of plants and roots, is linked to pharmaceutical cartels and genetically modified agriculture. The astronomical knowledge of Cockabeel is reframed as advanced astrology and used by ancient rulers and modern intelligence agencies to time geopolitical events. These theories often intertwine with interpretations of the Nephilim. Some propose that the giants in the earth were not entirely destroyed. They suggest that the spirits of the Nephilim and the Rephaim of the Hebrew Bible and became the demonic entities that crave incarnation. This, and in turn, and is linked to modern narratives of alien abduction and hybrid breeding programs, where non-human intelligences are said to be creating a new hybrid race and a direct echo of the Watcher Nephilim cycle. Visual narration, a slow pan across a 16th century woodcut depicting the Tower of Babel and with masons and architects working under the direction of a crowned king. The image is overlaid with a faint and translucent graphic of the Watcher Penemu, and who taught writing, and as described in the Book of Enoch. The camera then cuts to a shot of a modern data center and rows of humming servers and the Tower of Babel of the Information Age. A key figure in this modern mythology is the antediluvian king, often identified with Enoch himself, and but in a corrupted form. In some conspiracy circles, and Enoch is not the righteous scribe, but the first human to be initiated into the Watcher's secrets and becoming the Metatron, the angelic scribe who sits beside God's throne. This position is then seen as a template for a hidden global elite, a group of individuals who have achieved a form of angelic or transhuman status and wielding knowledge and power far beyond ordinary humanity. This is a direct inversion of the Qumran community's view, and where Enoch was the model of purity and not power. The Book of Jubilees provides another key element, the figure of Mastema and the chief of the spirits who survived the flood. In modern theories, and Mastema is not a demon, but a title for a ruling intelligence and a prince of the power of the air, who operates through global institutions like the United Nations or the World Economic Forum. The Qumran community saw themselves as fighting Mastema's influence through purity. Modern theorists see themselves as fighting a literal and hidden government. This modern mythology, and while far removed from the theological rigor of the Qumran library, and demonstrates the enduring power of the Watcher narrative. It has been adapted from a story of cosmic transgression and divine judgment into a story of a permanent and hidden war for control of humanity. The ancient fear of mingling the holy and profane has been translated into a modern fear of a global elite that has transcended the natural human condition. The evidence for these modern theories is not archaeological, but sociological and psychological. They reflect a deep-seated human need to explain inequality and suffering and the feeling of being controlled by unseen forces. The Watchers have become a potent symbol for that which is both alluring and terrifying. Knowledge without wisdom and power without accountability, and a history that is not what it appears to be. Thank you for watching this series on the Watchers. If you have a topic you would like us to investigate, from ancient mysteries to the hidden histories of the modern world, please submit your suggestion in the comments below.